I gripped the research vessel's railing tighter than necessary, my knuckles going white as I stared down into the black water that stretched endlessly below us. The irony never got old. Here I was, one of the world's leading oceanographers, and I couldn't even dog paddle without having a panic attack. 20 years of studying the ocean from the safety of ships and submersibles, always keeping that barrier of metal and glass between me and the thing that both fascinated and terrified me. The Calypso rocked gently beneath my feet, positioned directly over what we'd started calling the unnamed trench. Our sonar readings showed it extended well beyond the known boundaries of the Mariana, dropping into depths that made my stomach clench just thinking about them. After 3 months of mapping and exploring this region, we'd cataloged dozens of new species, but nothing that resembled the discovery I'd been chasing my entire career. Sarah's voice carried across the deck as she ran through her equipment checklist for what felt like the 100th time today. She had that methodical way of working that I'd come to appreciate over the years. Every tool accounted for, every procedure double-checked. James was hunched over the ROV controls, running diagnostics on the camera systems with the kind of focused intensity that meant he was getting antsy about our timeline. I turned away from the water and walked over to where they were working. The weight of our situation pressed down on me like the water pressure we'd been measuring all these months. Our funding was basically gone. The university had been patient, but 3 months of promising preliminary findings weren't enough to justify another extension. This dive, probably today and tomorrow, would be our last real shot at finding something significant. The thing was, I knew what I was looking for sounded crazy. Hell, it probably was crazy. But ever since I was a kid, lying in bed and reading about ocean mysteries, I'd been convinced that somewhere in those depths lived something intelligent, something beyond the typical deep-sea creatures we cataloged and published papers about. Maybe it was the mermaid stories that had captivated me as a 7-year-old, or maybe it was just the stubborn belief that in a world this vast and unexplored, we couldn't possibly be alone. 20 years of research later, I'd found bioluminescent jellyfish, previously unknown species of deep-sea fish, and coral formations that defied conventional understanding. Important stuff, sure. Career-making discoveries for most people. But none of it felt like enough. None of it felt like the thing I'd dedicated my life to finding. David, you want to look at these readings before we prep for descent? Sarah's question pulled me out of my head. I walked over to the monitoring station where she had printouts spread across the table, each page covered in depth measurements, temperature variations, and sonar mappings that represented months of painstaking work. Current's been stable for the past 6 hours, she continued, pointing to a series of graphs. Water temperatures holding consistent at the surface, and visibility should be optimal for the ROV cameras. James looked up from his position near the ROV deployment system. The remotely operated vehicle sat secured in its launch cradle, its lights and cameras looking like some kind of deep-sea insect, ready to be lowered into the abyss. All systems check out. We're looking at maybe 4 hours of battery life at maximum depth, so we'll need to be efficient about our search pattern. I nodded, trying to push down the familiar disappointment that had been building over the past few weeks. Each dive had started with the same hope, the same possibility that this would be the day we found something extraordinary. And each evening, we'd brought the ROV back to the surface with footage of empty ocean floor, and the occasional deep-sea creature that, while scientifically interesting, fell far short of the intelligent life I'd been seeking. Let's focus on the eastern wall of the trench today, I said, leaning over the sonar images. We've mapped most of the northern and western sections, but these readings show some interesting formations that might be worth investigating. Sarah traced her finger along the sonar printout, stopping at a series of irregular shapes near what appeared to be a massive rock formation. Could be cave systems. The geology down there is unlike anything we've documented in other trenches. The afternoon had been productive in terms of equipment prep, but I could feel the familiar restlessness building as we got closer to deployment time. This was always the hardest part, the hours before a dive when the possibilities felt infinite, before reality had a chance to disappoint me again. I was walking back toward the bow when Sarah called out from the stern. "Hey, what's this thing?" I turned to see her crouched near the hull, examining something in the water. James and I both moved over to where she was pointing, and I felt my stomach drop slightly when I saw what had caught her attention. A buoy floated alongside our ship, tethered by what looked like a professional-grade line to something beneath the hull. The buoy itself was unlike anything I'd seen before, bright colors that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of view, with markings that didn't match any standard research or navigation equipment I was familiar with. "That wasn't there this morning," James said, kneeling down next to Sarah for a better look. I checked the hull when we repositioned over the trench. Sarah was already reaching for the line, examining the attachment point where it connected to our ship. No damage to the hull. Whoever attached this knew what they were doing. This is a proper marine-grade connection. I stared at the buoy as it bobbed gently in the water, feeling an odd sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. The colors seemed almost hypnotic, and there was something about the whole situation that felt deliberately placed rather than coincidental. "Could be from another research vessel," James suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it himself. "Maybe they're marking territory or warning about underwater hazards." Sarah stood up, brushing off her hands. "Should we try to identify where it came from? There might be contact information or institutional markings we missed." James was already moving toward the equipment locker where we kept our cutting tools. "Or we could just cut it loose. If another team wants to mark this area, they can do it without attaching equipment to our ship." Something about that suggestion made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate why. The buoy didn't look like standard research equipment, and the fact that it had appeared overnight without any other vessels in the area raised questions I wasn't sure we should be ignoring. "Maybe we should document it first," I said. "Take some photos, record the GPS coordinates, make note of the materials and construction." James had already retrieved a pair of heavy-duty marine shears and was walking back toward where the line was attached. "We're losing daylight, and I want to get the ROV in the water before conditions change. This thing's probably just debris from a commercial fishing operation." Before I could object further, he'd positioned the shears around the line and cut through it with a single decisive motion. The buoy immediately began drifting away from our ship, carried by the current toward the open ocean. I watched it float away with a growing sense that we'd just made a mistake. The colors continued to shift and change as it moved further from us, and something about the way it moved through the water seemed too deliberate, too purposeful for random debris. "There," James said, coiling up the remaining line that had been attached to our hull. "Problem solved. Now can we focus on the dive?" Sarah was already moving back toward the ROV deployment area, but I remained at the stern, watching the buoy until it disappeared completely into the vast expanse of ocean surrounding us. The feeling of unease lingered, like we'd just ignored a warning we should have paid attention to. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades that reflected off the water's surface and made the ocean look almost alive. Our equipment was ready, our dive plan was finalized, and we had maybe 2 hours of optimal lighting left for the ROV cameras to capture clear footage of whatever waited in the depths below us. The ROV's descent had taken nearly an hour, and now, 3 hours into our dive, I found myself leaning closer to the monitor bank in the control room, watching the same endless parade of empty seafloor that had defined every previous expedition. The specialized deep-sea vehicle moved through the crushing darkness 2 miles below us, its powerful lights carving narrow cones of visibility through water so black it seemed to absorb the illumination. James worked the controls with practiced precision, his fingers dancing across the joystick as he guided our remotely operated vehicle along the eastern wall of the trench. The main display showed nothing but barren sediment plains and the occasional drift of marine snow, tiny particles of organic matter falling like underwater ash through the water column. Sarah sat at the documentation station, her laptop open as she cataloged each frame of footage. Her methodical approach to data collection had served us well over the years, but tonight I could sense her growing restlessness as the hours passed without significant findings. The timestamp on the corner of the screen showed we'd been at depth for exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes, burning through precious battery life while documenting an underwater desert. Depth holding steady at 11,400 feet, James reported, his voice carrying the focused monotone he adopted during technical operations. Currents minimal, visibility optimal. We're approaching the coordinates you marked on the sonar images. I studied the real-time sonar feed on the secondary monitor, watching the ghostly outlines of the trench wall scroll past as irregular formations and crevices appeared and disappeared in the acoustic mapping. The eastern wall showed more geological complexity than the areas we'd explored during previous dives, with numerous indentations and overhangs that could potentially harbor marine life. The main camera feed remained stubbornly empty. Occasionally, a jellyfish would drift across the frame, its translucent bell pulsing with bioluminescent patterns, or a deep-sea fish would appear at the edge of our lights before vanishing back into the darkness. Standard deep ocean fauna, nothing that suggested the kind of intelligent life I'd been seeking for 2 decades. My disappointment had been building steadily over the past hour. Each empty frame felt like confirmation that our funding had run out, just as we'd exhausted the possibilities this region offered. The university had been patient, but 3 months of promising preliminary findings weren't enough to justify the massive costs of deep-sea research. This dive would likely be our last real opportunity to find something extraordinary. "Wait," James said, his voice cutting through my internal spiral of professional despair. "What's that formation ahead?" I leaned forward, studying the monitor as our lights revealed something different in the landscape below. The seafloor dropped away sharply, and the ROV's illumination caught the edge of what appeared to be a massive opening in the trench wall. The darkness beyond our lights suggested a cave system of significant size. "That wasn't visible on the sonar mapping," Sarah said, her fingers already moving across her keyboard to begin documenting the discovery. The acoustic readings showed irregular formations, but nothing that looked like a cave opening of this scale. James adjusted the ROV's position, angling our cameras to get a better view of the formation. The opening yawned before us, easily large enough to accommodate our research vessel. The edges showed clear signs of geological carving, with smooth walls that suggested water flow over extended periods had shaped the entrance. "Let's move in closer," I said, feeling the first stirring of genuine excitement I'd experienced in weeks. "Keep the lights focused on the entrance. I want to document the geological structure before we attempt any interior exploration." The ROV descended toward the cave mouth, its cameras capturing detailed footage of the entrance formation. The walls showed stratified rock layers that spoke to millions of years of geological activity, and the smooth surfaces suggested this wasn't a recent formation. As we approached the threshold of the opening, our lights penetrated perhaps 30 feet into the interior before the darkness swallowed the illumination completely. "Incredible," Sarah murmured, her documentation forgotten as she stared at the monitor. This could be part of an extensive cave system. The potential for unique ecosystems in isolated underwater environments like this. I was about to respond when movement flickered at the edge of our camera frame. Something had shifted in the darkness beyond our lights, too large and deliberate to be marine snow or debris. "James, hold position," I said, my voice sharper than intended. "Did you see that movement?" He had already stopped the ROV's forward progress, holding us steady about 20 feet from the cave entrance. "Thought I saw something. But it could have been a current shift or..." The attack came without warning. Creatures erupted from the cave's mouth in a coordinated swarm, their forms unlike anything I'd ever encountered in 20 years of deep-sea research. They moved with terrifying speed through the water, their elongated bodies crackling with electrical discharge that caused our camera feeds to flicker and distort. "What the hell are those things?" James shouted, his hands already working the controls to retreat the ROV from the approaching swarm. The creatures were massive, each one easily 12 feet in length, with bodies that resembled oversized eels but possessed an alien quality that made my skin crawl. Their eyes glowed with an intense blue light that cut through the darkness, and when they opened their mouths, needle-sharp teeth became visible in rows that seemed designed for tearing rather than simple predation. "Get us out of here!" I yelled as the first creature reached our ROV, its body wrapping around the camera housing with disturbing intelligence. The electrical discharge from its skin caused our main monitor to flicker and scramble, distorting the image into static bursts. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard, frantically capturing every frame of footage as more creatures swarmed around our equipment. "This is incredible. Look at the coordination of their attack pattern, the way they're targeting our electronic systems specifically." More eels erupted from the cave opening, dozens of them moving in waves that suggested organized behavior rather than simple territorial aggression. They attacked our ROV with apparent purpose, their electrical fields interfering with our controls and causing system alerts to cascade across James's monitor bank. James fought to maintain control of the vehicle as the creatures pressed their assault. The ROV's thrusters strained against the current and the weight of multiple attackers, while our cameras captured close-up footage of alien faces that filled the screens with predatory intensity. Their eyes showed an intelligence that was deeply unsettling, as if they were studying our equipment even as they attacked it. "I'm losing hydraulic pressure in the manipulator arm," James reported, his voice tight with concentration. "These things aren't just aggressive, they're specifically targeting our mechanical systems." One creature pressed its face directly against the main camera, its glowing blue eyes staring into the lens with what looked like deliberate communication. The sight sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold control room. This wasn't random predatory behavior. These creatures were intelligent enough to understand they were being observed. "Electrical discharge is off the charts," Sarah called out, her eyes fixed on the instrument readings. "They're generating coordinated pulses that are designed to disrupt electronic equipment. This is sophisticated biological warfare." James managed to engage the ROV's emergency ascent protocol, using maximum thruster power to break free from the swarm. Several creatures maintained their grip on our equipment for the first 100 feet of ascent, their forms visible as dark shapes against our lights until the increasing pressure differential finally forced them to release their hold. The ascent took 45 minutes, during which we watched our monitors in tense silence. The creatures hadn't followed us beyond the immediate vicinity of the cave, suggesting they were territorial rather than simply aggressive. As we approached the surface, James ran diagnostics on all our systems while Sarah organized the footage we'd captured. "Camera housing shows significant scoring from those teeth," James reported as he checked the ROV's condition. "Manipulator arm is functioning, but the hydraulics are compromised. We're lucky they didn't completely destroy the equipment." The ROV broke the surface just as the last traces of daylight disappeared from the western horizon. We worked together to secure the vehicle in its deployment cradle. the familiar routine of equipment recovery providing some normalcy after the intensity of our encounter below. Sarah was already reviewing the footage on her laptop, her excitement visible in the way she leaned into the screen. "David, this is extraordinary. We've documented a completely unknown species with complex social behavior and sophisticated defensive capabilities. The electrical discharge patterns alone represent a breakthrough in our understanding of bioelectric organisms." James nodded enthusiastically as he coiled the deployment cables. The coordinated attack behavior, the way they specifically targeted our electronic systems. This isn't random predation. These creatures show tactical intelligence that could revolutionize our understanding of deep-sea ecosystems. I stood at the stern, looking out over the dark water that had swallowed our equipment just hours ago. The rational part of my mind understood that we'd made a significant discovery, a new species with remarkable adaptations that would certainly merit publication and scientific recognition. But instead of excitement or professional satisfaction, I felt only a crushing wave of disappointment that threatened to overwhelm me completely. These aggressive alien creatures were nothing like the intelligent life I'd spent my career seeking. They were predators, guardians of their territory who attacked anything that intruded on their domain. There was intelligence there, yes, but it was the cold, calculating intelligence of efficient killers, rather than the wonder I'd hoped to find in the ocean's depths. Sarah and James continued their excited discussion about research papers and follow-up expeditions, their voices carrying across the deck as they planned how to document and study our discovery. I listened to their enthusiasm with growing despair, understanding that what felt like failure to me represented career-defining success for them. The sun had disappeared completely below the horizon, leaving us surrounded by darkness, broken only by the Calypso's deck lights reflecting off the water's surface. Somewhere below us, those creatures waited in their cave, protecting whatever secrets lay hidden in the depths. But those secrets felt more like warnings now, reminders that some mysteries were meant to remain undisturbed, that my lifelong search for something extraordinary beneath the waves might end not with wonder, but with the kind of discovery that left me questioning everything I'd believed about the ocean I'd dedicated my life to studying. The control room felt too small, with Sarah and James's excitement filling every corner. While I stood there processing our encounter with those creatures, they had already moved into celebration mode, breaking out a bottle of whiskey from the ship's emergency supplies and spreading our equipment across the table like trophies from a successful hunt. "This changes everything," Sarah said for the third time in 10 minutes. Her laptop opened to frame after frame of the attack footage. "Look at the electrical discharge patterns here. Coordinated, purposeful, almost like they're communicating through bioelectric fields." James raised his glass, the amber liquid catching the overhead lights. "To the discovery that's going to make our careers. These things are going to rewrite the textbooks on deep-sea predator behavior." I watched them toast our findings and felt something break inside my chest. 20 years of searching, 20 years of believing I would find something magnificent in the depths, and this was what my career had led to. Aggressive monsters that attacked anything entering their territory. The rational part of my mind understood their excitement. We had documented a genuinely extraordinary species, with behaviors that challenged conventional understanding of marine ecosystems. But all I could see were those alien eyes staring into our camera with cold intelligence, those needle teeth designed for destruction. I poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey and settled into a chair away from their documentation station. The alcohol burned going down, but it dulled the sharp edge of disappointment that had been cutting through me since we hauled the ROV back to the surface. "Yeah, it's something all right." James looked up from his analysis of the equipment damage. "You sound like someone who just discovered his house is haunted instead of someone who just made the discovery of the century. What's eating you?" How could I explain that this felt like failure? That every frame of footage showing those creatures felt like proof that my lifelong search for something wonderful beneath the waves had been nothing more than childhood fantasy. These weren't the intelligent beings I had hoped to find. They were efficient killers protecting their domain with the kind of ruthless precision that made my skin crawl. "Nothing," I said, taking another drink. "Just tired, I guess." Sarah closed her laptop and moved over to where I sat, her expression shifting from excitement to concern. "This is huge, David. Publishing these findings is going to change how we understand deep-sea ecosystems. The university is going to have to extend our funding just to properly study the implications." The mention of extended funding should have made me feel relieved, but instead, it just highlighted how empty this victory felt. We would spend months analyzing footage of creatures that attacked anything entering their territory, documenting their predatory behaviors and defensive capabilities. Important work, certainly, but nothing like the discovery I had been seeking. "I need some air," I said, pushing back from the table and heading for the deck access. The evening had grown cold while we worked, and stepping outside hit me like walking into a different world. Our deck lights created a small bubble of visibility around the Calypso, but beyond that, darkness stretched endlessly in all directions. James had anchored us near a small rocky coastline for the night, close enough to shore that we could see the irregular outline of cliffs and beaches, but far enough out that we wouldn't worry about tidal changes or underwater obstacles. I walked to the port railing and looked out toward the dark water, trying to process the day's events and my strange reaction to what should have been professional triumph. The whiskey was working its way through my system, making the disappointment feel more manageable, but also more profound. Maybe Sarah and James were right to celebrate. Maybe I was being unreasonable to feel like this discovery represented some kind of failure. Movement on the distant shore caught my attention, and I leaned forward against the railing to get a better look. Through the darkness, I could make out a figure standing on what appeared to be a rocky outcropping near the water's edge. The silhouette looked human, a woman with long dark hair that seemed to move independently of any breeze I could detect from our position. She was watching our ship. Even from this distance, I could feel her attention focused on us with an intensity that made my already unsettled nerves tighten further. There was something about her posture, the way she stood perfectly still against the rocky backdrop, that seemed both natural and completely wrong. "Sarah, James," I called toward the control room. "Come look at this." I heard chairs scraping and footsteps moving across the deck as my colleagues joined me at the railing. James arrived first, still carrying his glass of whiskey, followed by Sarah with her jacket pulled tight against the evening air. "What are we looking at?" Sarah asked, scanning the dark coastline. I pointed toward the rocky outcropping where the figure had been standing. There was a woman on the shore watching us, long dark hair standing right. The outcropping was empty. I blinked hard, wiping my eyes and straining to see through the darkness, but whatever I had been watching was gone. The rocky shore stretched unbroken and uninhabited in both directions, showing no sign that anyone had ever been there. "I don't see anything," James said, his tone suggesting he was more concerned about my alcohol consumption than any mysterious figures on the shore. Sarah squinted toward the coastline, then looked at me with the kind of careful expression people used when they were worried about someone's mental state. Maybe it was just the way the rocks were catching our deck lights. Shadows can play tricks on you, especially after a day like today. I stared at the empty shore, knowing what I had seen but unable to argue with the evidence of my own eyes. The figure had been there. I was certain of it. A woman with long, dark hair, standing motionless on the rocks and watching our ship with focused attention. But now there was nothing. Just the dark coastline, and the sound of waves against stone. "Yeah," I said finally. "Probably just shadows." James clapped me on the shoulder with the kind of hearty gesture that suggested he thought I needed cheering up. Long day, too much excitement, and now whiskey on an empty stomach. Recipe for seeing things that aren't there. We stood at the railing for another few minutes, but the conversation had shifted back to their discoveries and plans for the research papers they would write about our findings. I listened with half my attention while watching the shore where the figure had vanished, feeling increasingly unsettled by the encounter. The woman had been real, I was sure of it. But more than that, something about her presence had felt significant in a way I couldn't explain. Standing there watching our ship, she had seemed less like a casual observer and more like someone who had been waiting for us specifically. The thought made no rational sense, but the feeling lingered even after Sarah and James returned to the control room to continue their analysis. I remained on deck, working my way through what was probably too much whiskey while watching the dark water and the empty shore. The alcohol should have made me sleepy, but instead it seemed to heighten my awareness of the night around us. The sound of waves against the hull, the distant crash of surf against the rocky coastline, the endless expanse of ocean stretching away in all directions. Around midnight, I heard Sarah and James shutting down their equipment and moving toward their quarters. Sarah stopped to check on me before heading below deck, her expression showing the kind of concern that made me realize I probably looked worse than I felt. "You should get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow we'll start going through all the footage frame by frame and we'll need clear heads for the analysis." I nodded and watched her disappear below deck, followed shortly by James after he secured the remaining equipment. The control room lights went out, leaving me alone with just the deck lighting and the sound of water moving around our anchored vessel. Sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those alien creatures erupting from the cave mouth, their cold intelligence and predatory efficiency mocking 20 years of searching for something wonderful in the depths. Or I saw the empty shore where a figure had been standing just hours ago, watching us with attention that felt too focused to be casual curiosity. I finished my drink and considered going below to my quarters, but the thought of lying in my narrow bunk staring at the ceiling held no appeal. Instead, I remained at the railing, looking out over the dark water and trying to understand why this day, which should have represented professional triumph, felt more like the end of something than a beginning. I pushed back from the railing and made my way to the stern where we kept the inflatable dinghy. The alcohol had settled into a dull buzz that made my movements feel slightly disconnected from my intentions, but the need to get away from the ship, away from Sarah and James's celebration, away from the control room that still reeked of their excitement over creatures that felt more like monsters than discoveries, drove me forward with surprising clarity. The dinghy's outboard motor started on the second pull, its quiet purr cutting through the night air as I navigated the short distance to shore. Our anchor lights reflected off the calm water in wavering columns of yellow and white, marking the Calypso's position against the dark coastline that had been calling to me for the past 2 hours. Beaching the small boat took more effort than usual, my coordination affected by whiskey and exhaustion, but I managed to drag it far enough up the rocky strand that the gentle waves wouldn't carry it away while I walked. The shoreline stretched in both directions, an irregular maze of stone formations and tide pools that caught moonlight in shallow silver mirrors. I needed distance from everything, from the ROV footage playing in my head, from the sound of my colleagues planning research papers about predatory eels, from the crushing weight of realizing that 20 years of searching had led me to document efficient killers instead of the intelligent life I dreamed of finding. The night air helped clear some of the fog from my head, but it couldn't touch the disappointment that sat in my chest like a physical weight. Walking along the uneven rocks required more attention than I'd expected. The moon provided enough light to see the general layout of the coastline, but shadows filled the spaces between larger formations, making each step a careful negotiation with terrain that shifted from smooth stone to sharp ridges without warning. The sound of waves against rock created a steady rhythm that matched my footsteps, and gradually I found myself moving farther from the dinghy and the ship's lights. The alcohol made everything feel slightly removed from reality, as if I were watching someone else pick their way across the rocky shore while processing the day's events. Maybe Sarah and James were right to celebrate. Maybe I was being unreasonable to feel like our discovery represented some kind of failure. Those creatures had demonstrated remarkable intelligence, sophisticated hunting behavior, and biological adaptations that challenged conventional understanding of deep-sea ecosystems. But every time I tried to summon enthusiasm for what we documented, all I could see were those cold, predatory eyes staring into our camera with calculating intelligence. There had been no wonder in that encounter, no sense of connection or communication, just the efficient aggression of territorial guardians protecting their domain from intruders. I'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I reached a section of coastline where the rocks formed natural barriers around clusters of tide pools. The moon's reflection broke into fragments across the shallow water, creating patterns that shifted with each gentle wave. Something about the scene made me slow my pace, then stop completely as my eyes adjusted to the interplay of light and shadow around the tidal formations. She sat on a large, flat rock at the edge of the largest tide pool, exactly as real and impossible as when I'd seen her from the ship's deck hours earlier. The same long, dark hair moved around her shoulders without any breeze I could detect, and her posture held the same perfectly still quality that had caught my attention across the water. But now, close enough to see her clearly, I understood why her presence had felt so unsettling from a distance. Everything about her was too perfect, too precisely arranged to be entirely human. Her skin seemed to catch and hold moonlight in ways that made her appear luminescent, and when she turned her head to look at me directly, her eyes reflected the silver light, like polished stones. She wore what appeared to be a flowing dress or robe that moved constantly around her form, its fabric seeming to shift between colors even in the limited light. She gestured for me to approach, a simple movement of her hand that carried an authority I couldn't explain or resist. Every rational thought in my head screamed warnings about the situation. A mysterious woman appearing on an isolated shore in the middle of the night, my compromised judgment from alcohol and emotional exhaustion, the basic stupidity of approaching someone whose presence defied logical explanation. But I found myself moving toward her anyway, picking my way carefully across the uneven rocks that separated us. Something about her drew me forward with a pull that felt deeper than curiosity or attraction, though both of those elements were certainly present. As I got closer, the otherworldly quality of her appearance became more pronounced rather than less. Her beauty held an ethereal perfection that made looking directly at her almost difficult, like trying to focus on something too bright. When I reached the edge of her rock, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her, she leaned forward without speaking and pressed her lips to mine. The kiss lasted only a moment, but the taste of her mouth filled my senses with flavors I couldn't identify. Salt, certainly, but underneath that, something else entirely. Something that reminded me of deep ocean currents and ancient waters that had never seen sunlight. Before I could react or speak, she pulled away and dove into the tide pool with fluid grace that belonged in deeper water. But instead of the shallow splash I expected, she disappeared beneath the surface, as if the small pool contained depths that couldn't possibly exist. The water barely rippled where she'd entered, leaving me staring at the moon's reflection across what should have been no more than 2 feet of seawater. "Wait!" I called out, my voice echoing off the surrounding rocks. "Come back!" The rational part of my mind understood that tide pools didn't work that way, that people couldn't simply vanish into shallow water, that everything about this encounter violated basic physical laws. But the taste of her kiss still lingered in my mouth, and somewhere beneath the surface, I could see the faint outline of movement that suggested she hadn't simply disappeared. Without conscious decision, I found myself pulling off my shoes and jacket, preparing to follow her into water that every instinct told me was far deeper than it appeared. My lifelong fear of water, the terror that had kept me on ships and in submersibles throughout my career, should have stopped me cold. I'd never learned to swim properly. I'd spent decades studying the ocean from the safety of vessels, specifically because the thought of being immersed in open water sent panic through my entire nervous system. But I stepped into the tide pool anyway, expecting to feel bottom stones under my feet. Instead, I plunged into depths that pulled me down with surprising force, the water closing over my head as I sank into what should have been impossible space beneath the rocky shore. My lungs filled with seawater, and instead of the drowning panic I'd expected, I found myself breathing normally. The water flowed in and out of my lungs like air, carrying oxygen to my blood through some process I couldn't begin to understand. The terror of submersion that had controlled my entire career simply vanished, replaced by a strange sense of belonging that made no logical sense. Through the water ahead of me, I could see her form moving with inhuman speed and grace, her body now surrounded by patterns of light that pulsed and shifted like living constellations. She moved through the underwater passages with the fluid efficiency of something born to this environment, glancing back occasionally to ensure I was following. The passages themselves defied everything I thought I knew about coastal geology. We moved through tunnels carved from living rock that stretched far beyond what should have been possible beneath a rocky shoreline, following currents that pulled us deeper and farther from the surface world I'd left behind. As we swam, and I was swimming somehow, moving through the water with coordination I'd never possessed, I began to understand that this woman was something far beyond human. Her movements held the natural grace of a creature perfectly adapted to the marine environment, and the bioluminescent patterns surrounding her form suggested biological capabilities that belonged in the deep ocean rather than in any terrestrial species. The realization filled me with growing amazement rather than fear. After 20 years of searching for intelligent life in the ocean's depths, I might have found exactly what I'd been seeking, not in the crushing darkness of the abyssal trenches, but in the form of a mysterious woman who had appeared on a moonlit shore and led me into hidden passages beneath the waves. She guided me through the underwater maze with purposeful direction, following routes that seemed familiar to her, even in the complete darkness that surrounded us beyond her luminescent glow. Whatever she was, wherever she was taking me, this encounter represented the discovery I'd spent my entire career pursuing. Something intelligent, something wonderful, something that might finally justify the faith I'd maintained in the ocean's hidden mysteries. The passage opened into a vast underwater chamber that defied every assumption I'd carried about the rocky coastline above us. Carved walls stretched upward beyond the reach of any light I could perceive, their surfaces smooth as if shaped by countless years of careful work, rather than natural erosion. The space felt cathedral-like in its dimensions, filled with currents that moved with purposeful direction through what must have been an ancient network of channels and chambers. Maya stopped swimming and turned to face me in the center of the chamber, her form suspended in the water with the kind of effortless grace that belonged to creatures born for this environment. What I had seen of her on the surface, the ethereal beauty, the two perfect features, had been just a glimpse of something far more extraordinary. Her true form revealed itself gradually, as if the water itself were pulling away layers of concealment she had maintained during our surface encounter. The flowing dress that had moved around her on the rocky shore dissolved into patterns of light that emanated from her skin itself. Scales emerged along her arms and shoulders, each one catching and amplifying the bioluminescent glow until her entire body shimmered with constellations of blue and green radiance. The transformation continued downward, her legs merging and reshaping into a powerful tail that moved through the water with fluid precision. The scales that covered its length pulsed with rhythmic patterns that seemed to respond to her emotions or thoughts, creating a living display of color and light that made watching her almost hypnotic. Her face remained recognizably the same, the dark eyes that had reflected moonlight on the shore, the features that had drawn me across the rocky tide pools. But now they held an otherworldly quality that made perfect sense in this underwater realm. She belonged here completely, every aspect of her form designed for life in the ocean's depths. "My name is Maya," she said, her voice carrying through the water with perfect clarity despite the medium that should have made speech impossible. The sound held musical qualities I'd never heard in human voices, notes that seemed to resonate through the water itself and reach me as naturally as if we were standing in open air. I tried to respond, but found myself overwhelmed by the impossibility of the situation. Here I was, breathing underwater without any equipment, watching a creature of legend speak to me with casual familiarity, while bioluminescent patterns played across her form like living artwork. 20 years of scientific training warred with the evidence of my own senses, but the rational part of my mind had long since given up trying to process this encounter through conventional understanding. "You're wondering how this is possible," Maya continued, her tail moving in slow, graceful sweeps that kept her positioned in front of me. "The breathing, the depth, your ability to survive in this environment. I've granted you temporary protection for our meeting, a gift that allows surface dwellers to exist in our domain for brief periods." The casual way she mentioned granting me superhuman abilities drove home just how far beyond normal experience this encounter had moved. I was speaking with a mermaid in an underwater cave, protected by powers I couldn't begin to understand. And somehow the most remarkable thing was how natural it all felt once the initial shock wore off. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice carrying through the water just as clearly as hers had, though without the musical quality that made her speech sound like something between conversation and song. Maya's expression shifted into something that might have been sadness mixed with ancient weariness. "We are what humans might call mermaids, though that word carries associations with fairy tales and children's stories that barely touch the reality of our existence. My people once lived on the land, millions of years ago, when the earth was younger and the boundaries between sea and shore were different than they are now." She gestured around us at the carved chamber walls, their surfaces now catching and reflecting her bioluminescent glow in patterns that suggested deliberate artistry. "As the world changed around us, as climates shifted and continents moved, we made a choice that your species has never faced. We chose to return to the ocean rather than fight against the planet's evolution." The implications of what she was telling me hit like a physical weight. A species that had voluntarily adapted to marine life, that had somehow retained intelligence and apparently developed civilization beneath the waves, while humanity struggled to understand even basic deep-sea ecosystems. Everything I thought I knew about ocean life, about evolution, about the relationship between land and sea creatures, was being rewritten with every word she spoke. "We've remained hidden from your kind throughout all of human history," Maya continued, her patterns shifting to deeper blues as her tone became more serious. "We learned early that contact with surface dwellers brings only destruction. Your species has a talent for exploiting anything it discovers, for turning knowledge into weapons or profit." The accusation stung because I couldn't argue against it. Human history was littered with examples of exactly what she described: First contact situations that ended in exploitation, unique ecosystems destroyed for commercial gain, indigenous populations devastated by contact with more technologically advanced societies. If mermaids had remained hidden for thousands of years, they had probably made the smart choice. "But you've been watching us," I said, remembering her earlier words about observing me specifically for months. "Watching me." Maya's expression softened, and the patterns across her scales shifted back toward the warmer greens and golds I'd first seen. "Yes. For months now, I've been studying you and your research methods. Most humans who come to the deep ocean arrive with nets and machines designed to capture and catalog, to reduce everything they find to specimens and data points. But you've always approached the sea differently." She moved closer, close enough that I could see the intricate details of her scales, each one seeming to contain entire galaxies of shifting light. "You study the ocean with respect, with wonder. You seek understanding rather than dominance. And most importantly, you've been searching for something specific, something you hoped to find but never expected to capture." The truth of her observation made me uncomfortable because it highlighted just how different my motivations were from conventional scientific research. I had been searching for something wonderful, something that would justify my faith in the ocean's mysteries, but I'd never planned what I would do if I actually found it. "The creatures we encountered in the trench," I said, suddenly understanding the connection between that morning's events and this impossible conversation. "Those were yours." Maya nodded, her expression becoming more serious. "The Guardians. They protect our territories from surface intrusion, keeping the boundaries between our world and yours intact. They responded to your presence exactly as they were designed to do, with force sufficient to discourage further exploration." The memory of those cold, predatory eyes staring into our camera took on new meaning. They hadn't been random deep-sea creatures. They had been sentries, guards positioned to defend something precious from discovery. They were intelligent, coordinated, very much so. The Guardians have protected our people for thousands of years, and they would have destroyed your vessel and everyone aboard if I hadn't intervened. Maya's pattern shifted to deeper, more warning colors. "The buoy your colleague cut away. That was my attempt to warn you off peacefully, a message that you had reached the boundary of human territory and should go no further." James had dismissed the buoy as random debris from another research vessel, but it had been a deliberate warning from a civilization we never suspected existed. We had ignored it and pushed forward anyway, triggering an encounter that could have ended very differently than it had. "You saved us," I realized. "I convinced the Guardians to show restraint, to disable your equipment rather than destroy it completely. But that protection was limited and temporary. If you had returned to that area, if you had attempted to explore deeper into our territory, they would not have been so gentle." The thought of what might have happened if we'd made a second dive sent cold understanding through me. Those creatures hadn't been testing our defenses or studying our equipment. They had been delivering a final warning before lethal force. Maya had somehow prevented our research expedition from becoming a tragedy that would have left no survivors and no explanation. "Why?" I asked. "Why protect us? Why reveal yourself to me?" Maya's expression shifted into something more personal, more vulnerable than the authoritative presence she had maintained while explaining her people's history. "Because I've been searching for someone worthy of learning about our civilization, someone who could be trusted with our greatest secrets." The weight of what she was offering hit me like a physical force, not just the knowledge that mermaids existed, not just the understanding that an entire civilization thrived beneath the waves, but something far more significant: inclusion in that secret, partnership in protecting it. For months, I've watched you work, Maya continued. Studied your research methods, observed how you interact with the ocean environment. Most humans who seek us do so with the intention of proving our existence to their surface world. But you've been searching for something else entirely: connection, understanding, wonder. Her assessment of my motivations was accurate in ways that made me uncomfortable. I had been seeking something wonderful, something that would justify decades of faith in the ocean's mysteries. But I'd never considered what I would do with such a discovery once I found it. Never thought through the implications of proving the existence of something that might be better left hidden. Your colleagues celebrate today's encounter because they see it as the foundation for research papers and career advancement, Maya said, her tone holding gentle criticism rather than judgment. But you understood immediately that those creatures represented something more complex than simple predation. She was right. While Sarah and James had planned their documentation strategy and discussed the implications for deep-sea research, I had been processing the encounter as evidence of intelligence rather than just exotic biology. The creatures' coordinated behavior, their specific targeting of electronic systems, their apparent communication through bioelectric fields, all of it had suggested sophisticated organization rather than random aggression. I want to show you something, Maya said, her pattern shifting to colors I hadn't seen before, shades of deep purple and silver that seemed to carry anticipation and excitement. Something no human has ever witnessed. The true scope of what exists beneath your surface world. The offer hung between us in the water, carrying implications I could barely process. She was proposing to share knowledge that her people had protected for thousands of years, to bring me into secrets that could reshape human understanding of the planet itself. But accepting would mean becoming complicit in that secrecy, choosing to protect their hidden world rather than reveal it to scientific study. Everything I had worked toward, every grant proposal and research expedition and published paper, had been building toward a discovery like this. But now, faced with the reality of finding intelligent life in the ocean's depths, I understood that the discovery itself was less important than what I chose to do with it. Maya waited for my response, her bioluminescent patterns shifting slowly through the spectrum while currents moved around us in the carved chamber. The decision felt monumental and simple at the same time, the choice between satisfying scientific curiosity and protecting something precious that had survived hidden for millennia. "Show me," I said. Maya's patterns brightened, shifting to warm golds and greens that seemed to pulse with anticipation. She turned gracefully in the water and began swimming toward what I had assumed was a solid wall of the chamber. As we approached, I realized the surface held subtle variations in color and texture that suggested an opening camouflaged by the play of her bioluminescent light against the carved stone. She passed through what appeared to be solid rock, and I followed, discovering a narrow passage that curved away from the chamber into darkness. The walls pressed close enough that I could have touched both sides if I extended my arms, but Maya navigated the space with fluid confidence that spoke of countless previous journeys through these hidden routes. The passage gradually widened and began to slope downward, carrying us deeper beneath the ocean floor than should have been possible given our starting point near the surface. The water around us grew warmer, and I began to notice a faint glow ahead that had nothing to do with Maya's natural luminescence. The light grew stronger as we swam, taking on qualities I'd never encountered before, not the harsh, artificial illumination of research vessels or the cold blue-white of bioluminescent deep-sea creatures, but something that seemed organic and welcoming. The passage opened into space so vast that my mind struggled to process its dimensions. We emerged onto what could only be described as a balcony carved from living coral, overlooking a city that defied every assumption I'd ever made about what could exist beneath the ocean's surface. Towers of coral spiraled upward from the seafloor in graceful curves, their surfaces covered with organisms that pulsed and glowed in synchronized patterns. The structures weren't built in any conventional sense. They had been grown, shaped over what must have been thousands of years into architectural forms that blended seamlessly with the ocean environment. Channels of crystal-clear water flowed between the spires, carrying currents that moved with purposeful direction through the urban landscape. Mermaids swam through those channels in numbers that made my breath catch in my throat. Dozens of them, moving with the same fluid grace Maya possessed, their forms varying in size and coloration, but all sharing the unmistakable characteristics I'd witnessed in her transformation. Some traveled alone, others in small groups, their bioluminescent patterns creating moving constellations throughout the city's thoroughfares. Children, young mermaids whose scales showed brighter, more vivid colors than their elders, darted between the larger structures in games that involved chasing streams of light through the water. Adults moved with more purpose, carrying objects I couldn't identify, tending to coral gardens that seemed to respond to their touch, engaging in activities that spoke of a complex, organized society. The sheer scale of what I was witnessing hit me like a physical weight. This wasn't some isolated pocket of unusual sea life, or a small enclave of mythical creatures. This was a functioning civilization, complete with infrastructure, social organization, and what appeared to be thousands of inhabitants going about their daily lives in the ocean's depths. How long has this existed? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to process the impossibility spread out before us. This particular city has been here for over 10,000 years, Maya replied, her own patterns reflecting pride and deep affection for what we were observing. But our civilization is far older than that. When your ancestors were just beginning to develop agriculture, we had already established settlements across every ocean basin on your planet. The implications of her words staggered me. While human civilization had been slowly developing from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural settlements, an entire species had been building cities beneath the waves, developing technology and culture that had remained completely hidden from surface awareness. The currents connect us, Maya continued, gesturing toward the channels that flowed through the city with apparent purpose. Ancient waterways that carry information, resources, and travelers between settlements, separated by thousands of miles. What you see here is just one small part of a network that spans the globe. I watched a group of adult mermaids guide a school of what looked like engineered fish through one of the major channels, the creatures moving in perfect formation while carrying what appeared to be messages or supplies. The level of organization, the integration with marine ecosystems, the sophisticated understanding of ocean dynamics. Everything spoke of a civilization that had achieved harmony with their environment in ways humanity had never managed. Your people, I said, still struggling to find words adequate for what I was witnessing. They've been watching us this whole time. Maya's patterns shifted to more somber colors, blues and purples that carried weight and concern. For thousands of years, yes, we've observed human development with growing unease, watching your species spread across the land and begin to explore the oceans with increasing sophistication. She moved closer to me on the coral balcony, her expression becoming more serious as she continued. Your technology advances at a rate that concerns my people greatly. Every year, your deep-sea exploration capabilities improve. Your sonar reaches deeper, your submersibles dive farther, your understanding of ocean systems grows more complete. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own research had been part of that advancing exploration, contributing to the very technological progress that threatened to expose their hidden civilization. You're afraid we'll find you. We know you will find us, Maya corrected. The question has never been whether discovery would occur, but when, and more importantly, what the consequences would be for both our species. Her words carried implications that sent cold understanding through me. Discovery wouldn't just mean the revelation of mermaid existence to human science. It would mean the end of their protected isolation, the beginning of contact between species with vastly different capabilities and motivations. The Guardians exist for more than just territorial protection, Maya explained, watching my face as comprehension dawned. They were created to defend our civilization against any threat that could expose our existence. If human exploration reaches critical levels, if your species begins to map our territories or attempt to establish permanent deep-sea installations, the Guardians have standing orders to respond with lethal force. The creatures that had attacked our ROV, that had demonstrated such calculating intelligence and coordinated behavior, weren't just protecting a single settlement. They were defending an entire civilization that saw human advancement as an existential threat requiring military response. How many humans would die? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the scope of what she was describing. Maya's patterns darkened to deep purples that spoke of ancient sadness and terrible responsibility. All of them, if necessary. The Guardians number in the millions, scattered throughout every ocean. They have capabilities your surface science has never encountered. Technologies that could disable your coastal cities and destroy your maritime infrastructure within days. The casual way she described potential genocide drove home just how fundamentally different our species' perspectives were. What humans would view as an unprovoked attack, mermaids saw as necessary defense against inevitable discovery and exploitation. The vast technological gap between our civilizations meant that contact would likely end with the complete destruction of one species or the other. But you brought me here, I said, trying to understand why she would share this knowledge with someone from the very species they viewed as an existential threat. Because I believe there might be another path. Maya replied, her pattern shifting back toward warmer colors. For months, I've studied not just your research methods, but your character. You approach the ocean with reverence rather than dominance. You seek understanding rather than exploitation. Most importantly, you've demonstrated the ability to keep discoveries private when sharing them would cause harm. Her assessment reminded me of my own reaction to finding the hostile creatures in the trench. How I'd felt disappointed rather than excited. How their aggressive nature had seemed to mock my search for something wonderful rather than simply unusual. She had been watching during that encounter, observing my response to discovering something that challenged my preconceptions about ocean life. Your colleagues celebrate today's encounter because they see it as a foundation for career advancement, Maya continued. But you understood immediately that those creatures represented something beyond simple predation. You recognized intelligence and organization that deserved respect rather than exploitation. The weight of what she was offering began to settle over me like a physical presence. This wasn't just about satisfying scientific curiosity or making groundbreaking discoveries. She was proposing to trust me with knowledge that could reshape human understanding of the planet itself, or trigger a conflict that would end with the destruction of everything I'd ever known. I can offer you a choice, Maya said, her voice taking on formal tones that suggested she was sharing options that had been carefully considered over long periods of time. You can return to your surface life with no memory of this encounter. I have the ability to remove these experiences from your mind, leaving only the recollection of a successful research expedition that documented unusual deep-sea creatures. The prospect of forgetting this moment, of returning to the Calypso with no knowledge of what existed beneath the waves, felt like losing something precious before I'd even fully grasped what it meant. But I could understand the appeal of that option, returning to my normal life without the burden of impossible secrets or the weight of knowing about conflicts that could destroy both civilizations. Alternatively, Maya continued, you can accept the responsibility of keeping our secret while gaining something far more valuable than any scientific discovery. The ability to visit our world whenever you wish, to learn about our civilization and culture, to become part of something larger than human experience. Her patterns shifted to colors I hadn't seen before, deep reds and golds that seemed to pulse with emotional significance. I've been searching for someone worthy of learning our greatest secrets, someone who could be trusted with knowledge that my people have protected for millennia. But more than that, I've been seeking a partner. The word hung between us in the water, carrying implications that went far beyond simple cooperation or alliance. She was offering not just knowledge or access, but something infinitely more personal and profound. Our species can interbreed, Maya explained, her bioluminescence taking on patterns that seemed almost shy despite their alien beauty. The children of such unions possess abilities that neither parent species can achieve alone. They can exist in both worlds, serve as bridges between civilizations, help guide the kind of contact that might prevent the destruction my people fear. The magnitude of what she was proposing staggered me. Not just partnership in protecting mermaid secrets, not just access to their hidden civilization, but the possibility of creating something entirely new. Offspring that could navigate between worlds, that might represent hope for peaceful coexistence rather than inevitable conflict. I've observed your character for months, Maya continued, studied your approach to research, watched how you interact with ocean ecosystems. You possess the qualities necessary for such a union: respect for marine life, understanding of the ocean's complexity, and most importantly, the wisdom to value preservation over exploitation. The rational part of my mind recognized the impossibility of what she was offering. I was a human scientist with a career and colleagues and responsibilities in the surface world. She was a member of an alien species that viewed humanity as an existential threat. The biological, cultural, and practical barriers to any kind of meaningful relationship between us were staggering. But watching the bioluminescent patterns play across her form as she waited for my response, I realized that rational analysis had become irrelevant. 20 years of searching for something wonderful in the ocean's depths had led me to this moment, this choice, this impossible woman who offered partnership in protecting mysteries that were more valuable than any scientific publication. Yes, I said, the word carrying more certainty than I'd felt about anything in years. Maya's patterns exploded into brilliant displays of gold and silver that lit up the entire coral balcony. You accept? I accept, I confirmed, understanding that I was agreeing to far more than I could fully comprehend. Everything. The responsibility, the secrets, the partnership, all of it. The transformation in her expression was immediate and profound. The formal authority she had maintained while explaining her people's situation gave way to something much more personal, more vulnerable. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted to warm, intimate colors that seemed to wrap around us both as she moved closer. Then you should know my true purpose in seeking you out, Maya said, her voice taking on musical qualities I hadn't heard before. I am among the last of my generation who has not yet chosen a mate. For my people, such unions are not just personal choices, but responsibilities to our species' continuation. The implications hit me with surprising force. She hadn't just been observing my research methods or evaluating my character for general partnership. She had been assessing my suitability as the father of her children, as a genetic contributor to the next generation of her species. You've been testing me, I realized. Evaluating, she corrected gently. learning whether you possessed not just the wisdom to protect our secrets, but the deeper qualities necessary for creating offspring who could bridge our worlds. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something like completion, as if every choice I'd made throughout my career had been leading toward this moment of perfect purpose. My lifelong search for something wonderful in the ocean's depths hadn't led me to a scientific discovery that would advance human knowledge. It had brought me to a love that transcended species boundaries and a role that could help prevent the destruction of both civilizations. I've spent my entire career looking for proof that something intelligent existed in the ocean, I said, watching her patterns shift in response to my words. I thought I was searching for a discovery that would change science, but I was really looking for a place where I belonged. Maya reached out and took my hands in hers, her touch carrying warmth that had nothing to do with water temperature and everything to do with connection that felt deeper than anything I'd experienced in the surface world. The bioluminescent patterns along her arms pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, creating a visual representation of the bond forming between us. "Your search has ended," she said, her voice carrying certainties that resonated through the water around us. "And our new life together is about to begin." Looking out over the impossible city spread below us, watching thousands of mermaids go about their daily lives in a civilization that had thrived hidden beneath the waves for millennia, I understood that my choice had given me something far more valuable than any scientific discovery. I had found not just intelligent life in the ocean's depths, but a purpose that would give meaning to everything that came after, protecting a world of wonders while building a bridge toward peaceful coexistence between species.